Welcome to the Practice as Research Network. This is the first in our seminar series this autumn. And for this autumn, we've decided to focus on reflexivity within practice as research. So today, to kick us off on that topic, we have got with us Dr Marquard Smith, Mark, and Dr Bruno de Paula. The two of them are going to be talking about reflexivity within practice as research. I would like to introduce you now to the two speakers that we have. That's Dr. Mark Smith, Associate Professor in Culture, Communications and Media. Mark is teaching on the MA Museums and Galleries in Education. He will say more about his own work, obviously, just in a minute. And our second presenter today is Dr. Bruno de Paula, who is lecturer in digital media production, also in culture, communication and media. So I'm very proud and very happy to present our own speakers from culture, communication and media. Handing over to you, Mark.
Brilliant, thanks, Nicole. Let me see if I can share my screen. Oh, I can see some people. Hello, people. How nice. There we go. I'm somebody who's not acclimatized to our brave new world over the last 18 months, so I still struggle painfully and embarrassingly, but that's okay. It might be that I end up doing something a little bit like that. Is that okay? Is that legible?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And we can see the slide.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nicole. First of all, just to say thanks very much to Nicole, who's been working incredibly hard over the last year and a half or so to get this network up and running, and has already done so much within our department and within IOE to make it possible. Today's event, the first of many over the next few months, is really kind of testament to her hard work and her commitment, and the potential that she sees in practice as research. So thanks very much to her, and obviously to Bruno, and to everybody else for coming. I'm going to try and keep it to 10 minutes. I am going to start by reading you my pitch, which is, as Nicole said, a little bit about me. I somehow feel like I spend my whole time speaking about me and I never get to speak about me. So I'm not quite sure what this is. It's maybe somewhere in the middle. Maybe it's part of the nature of practice as research, to not quite know how at the fore of one's own activity we are, and when to put ourselves forward as autobiographical subjects, and when to slip into the background and pretend to approximate some form of objectivity. But the next 10 minutes is definitely all about me. As I said in the abstract, I collaborate with cultural organizations as a curator, as a programmer, and I should have also said as an editor as well. And I think of curating and programming, and also editing, as critical pedagogical practices and opportunities for learning in public to extend academia's responsibilities into the public domain in order to engage publics beyond higher education and expand the places in which, and I think for me, for the next 10 minutes, the word places is absolutely key. The places in which, and thus the ways in which, learning might take place. I'm committed to curating, programming, and editing as well, as a praxis that's generative of new ways of thinking, seeing, knowing, and doing. And so that's what I'm going to be speaking about today. Curating's always been really interesting for me, and something I did before even really quite understanding what it was. I'd always been involved in collaborating, and curating was just a particular kind of manifestation of that, that I began doing in a more kind of exhibitionary context in around 2010. So it was only really after the fact that I came to realize that the etymology of curating goes back to care, and it goes back to curiosity. And, you know, it strikes me that to have a curatorial practice that's all about care and all about curiosity is a pretty damn good place to start. I think that I put the abstract out in part for that reason, you know, just for us to kind of flag up care, questions of care, critical care, you know, especially in, you know, the neoliberal university and, you know, the conditions in which we found ourselves over the last 18 months and the expectations that we've had put on us and that we've put on ourselves during that period. Also, just to say, I'm really interested in what you might call learning through doing. It's very popular within an art school context, which is where I've spent the bulk of my time as an academic. I'm not a practitioner, but being in the company of practitioners has certainly led me to think about teaching and writing and curating and programming and editing as practices that have similar kinds of histories, similar kinds of kind of, you know, material kind of conditions for production. So, you know, learning through doing is obviously really key for me. I really like the way that research is embedded in and articulated by way of practice. And I think for me, curating becomes a really interesting way of doing that. There's a very kind of reflexive, very discursive nature to that kind of activity, where you're not necessarily kind of trumpeting research per se, but very involved in the process of collaborating, the process of developing projects, the process of, you know, working with school teachers, with artists, with museum and gallery directors on kind of developing and realizing those projects within environments, and how those environments, those places, are really conducive to very different kinds of learning. So I'm just to put the first slide up, you know, I have done some curating in white cubes, but I'm much more interested in messy places and messy spaces and environments that are what I call compromised. So, you know, if one wants to come up with a phrase like, you know, the compromised curator, you know, I'm somebody who really likes having to attend to and be responsive to the environment in which I find myself. You know, I think kids are fantastic at that. And, you know, I think that the, you know, kids and family programming that a lot of museums and galleries have, you know, just do away with all of the elitism and the privilege and the etiquette that one finds taking place within a gallery environment. I like that a lot. I've curated exhibitions in cafes. I've curated exhibitions like a few years ago at the Freud Museum, where the material was so sexually explicit that they had to put it in a locked room with a over 18s only sign on the door, which led to a whole series of really interesting conversations about what a museum like the Freud Museum was actually for. There are some slides on the bottom right corner of an exhibition I curated a couple of years ago at UCLH in a corridor, you know, which was probably seen by 10,000 people over the course of 3 months. Not necessarily art-going people. They were porters, they were nurses, they were doctors, they were patients, they were carers. There were a whole bunch of people who had no choice but to look at the images, and that were part of an exhibition to do with living with cancer. And so how one negotiates that space and how one makes it conducive and kind of respectful, you know, whilst at the same time trying to present potentially challenging contemporary art was a really interesting question for us. You know, the care that we needed to take for audiences as yet unknown. So yeah, learning through doing, research embedded and articulated by way of practice, the capacity that spaces have to offer themselves up in ways that aren't determined in advance. And, you know, for me, that's really key when it comes to practice as research and the nature of self-reflexive practice. You know, the outcomes aren't determined in advance. And, you know, I really do like that very much. I'm noticing the time. I've probably got about, what, 4 minutes left? Something like that. Okay, so I'm going to whiz through a bunch of projects really quickly, just to kind of point out that pretty much everything that I do these days is driven by kind of social and civic justice, and issues around accessibility, inclusivity, and diversification. It might be that those things are the content of my research, but it's more than likely that there are issues that are woven into the fabric of the process of the doing of the projects. So, for instance, I don't do research on disability issues in museums, but I'll work very closely with staff and health and safety and practitioners, as well as audiences, to think through the nature of structures and infrastructures that actively mitigate against access. Right, so that has that kind of reflexive, discursive quality. Okay, so really quickly, I'm going to whiz through this stuff. Nicole has a copy of this PowerPoint, which I'm very happy to share. To flag up a couple of projects over the last few years around research, and thinking about the nature of programming and the kind of institutions you work with, the kind of events you put on, the nature of curating a public program. A lot of issues have come up in the last few years, around kind of, gender equality within panels and so on and so forth. I know in the social sciences and the sciences much more than the arts and humanities. But, so thinking through the nature of one's events and who's invited and who gets to be in the room and who gets to speak, and how one can have a position of relative power and authority, and find ways of giving that power and authority up to other people, to other voices, and to be a good ally as a white middle class straight guy working in higher education, to be a good ally, and perhaps in fact to be a good accomplice, and to play an active role in niggling away at institutions of higher education, as well as cultural institutions. Okay, a few projects with students, just thinking about the space of the internet, and how digital media offers itself up as a particular kind of platform for distribution, and what that affords a group of students interested in any given topic. In this instance, it happened to be about the nature of mixed heritage, and how one thinks about foregrounding the question of mixed heritage in one's practice as educators, as learning facilitators, as curators, and as artists. An exhibition I curated a few years ago in Lithuania, where if you look in the bottom right hand corner, you can see that we plonked an education zone right in the middle of the exhibition itself. So within this kind of 4,000 square foot pristine white space, we created an environment for talking, and people talked all day, all night. We got the technicians involved in the art school, we got the cooks from the cafeteria, we worked with a load of local community organizations and arts organizations and activist organizations. We kind of put conversation at the heart of the discourse of art, and it completely disrupted the expectations and conditions under which art can and should be viewed. So I'm really interested in kind of being together in different kind of ways, and thinking about how one can kind of stretch and transform, and perhaps even destroy some of those pre-existing structures and operating systems. Hanging out together, sitting on the floor, sitting in circles, walking and talking, finding ways of, I guess, exploding the classroom. You can call it a museum without walls, where you can move beyond particular kind of organization of power and knowledge as it takes place often within the classroom, but also within the museum and gallery sector as well. 1 minute to go. A really fun little project that we did with the MA students last year around rewriting their nation's national curriculum, which I'd advise everybody to encourage their students to do, because it was just loads and loads of fun. They just poured everything that they'd learned and read and experienced into kind of destroying and reconstructing the national curriculum, recognizing that if the national curriculum's a really big part of the problem in which we find ourselves within education, then it was also part of the solution. And rewriting it with accessibility, inclusivity, and diversification at the fore, with issues of social and civic justice, was a really interesting way of recognizing what education has the capacity to be and do. A lot of us seem to have forgotten that it was meant to be a force for good rather than just bureaucracy and red tape. And then finally, a couple of projects that I've worked on in the last year or so, partly because museums, galleries and heritage sites are closed, no one to play with, no one to collaborate with. And, thinking again about these places and spaces as sites for distribution, right? It doesn't matter whether they're in the real world, doesn't matter whether they're digital, doesn't matter whether they're exhibitions or public programs or publications. And so with some collaborators in Berlin, we put together a really large collection around COVID and how the arts and humanities, or at least how artists and scholars in the humanities, might engage with and respond to and contribute to an extent to the debate. It was an online publication that's been shared very widely and is a beautiful thing to look at and engage with. And then even more recently, just last week, was the publication of a themed issue of the Journal of Visual Culture around Palestine, where again, collaboration was at the forefront, and thinking about the responsibilities that we have and the opportunities that we have to give over these spaces for conversation and for distribution, and to use these platforms in ways that they might not ordinarily be used, to kind of give up one's gatekeeping authority and find other ways of exercising the power and the authority that we have in ways that are actually beneficial to people other than ourselves. There we go, I'm done. Sorry, slightly over.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. I really appreciate the time that you've taken to talk to us about your work. I totally love it. It's really, really fascinating. I do have one question that's come up, that's been sent to me. And you were saying right at the beginning of your presentation, you were saying that on the one hand, it feels like you're talking about yourself a lot, and on the other hand, it feels like you're never talking about yourself. How do you, in all your work that you've just presented, how do you draw the line of how much of yourself you put into that work, and how do you withdraw from your own work in that sense, in all of those projects that you've just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I must admit, I don't know how many people are on the call, and I don't know who's on the call, and I don't know how late in the evening it is and whether I've had a glass of wine or not yet. I think I might give very different answers depending on all of those things. It's a really good question, and it's something that comes up a lot. Because of my own positionality and because of the way that I think about higher education. I think I've ended up becoming more and more explicit in situating myself in relation to my own practice in the last few years. I think previously it was very much about saying, I am invisible, I am, the hand of God, the puppet master behind this, that, and the other. And, I'm happy, to be a benign dictator, which is, how I talk about myself in relation to the Journal of Visual Culture that I've been editing for the last 20 years. I'm a benign dictator who, gives space over to other people on his own terms. And I think that's how I've worked it for a long time. I think that over the last few years, I've become more sensitive to realizing that I need to take more responsibility for myself, to account for myself in a different kind of way, and rather than kind of work with other people in a way that invisibilizes myself, you know, to step up and say, I have this power, I have this authority, I'm a straight white middle-aged bloke, I have to do something about it. And part of what I get to do is to take responsibility for how I'm going to be an academic and how I'm going to do research and what kind of a colleague I'm going to be and what kind of a facilitator of learning I'm going to be, and to be very clear about kind of what my position is in relation to that. So you know, it's all about me and not about me, and you know, I think that's kind of true for all of us. You know, I think anyone who pretends otherwise is deluding themselves or lying.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Just to say, because you were saying you don't really know who's on the call, we have got colleagues from culture, communications and media, but we've also got colleagues from other departments across UCL, and excitingly from way beyond that. So I have already spotted a friend and colleague from South Africa, a friend and colleague from Costa Rica, a friend and colleague from the United States of America. So I'll proudly present to you that we are now formally internationalized. So thank you very much for that. Bruno, handing over to you.
So, well, my name is Bruno. I am at the Cultural Communication and Media Department at UCL as well. I am a lecturer in digital media production, and I work mostly in the MA Digital Media program. And I can see that we have some colleagues here that also teach in the same program with me in this call. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about a specific research project that I have done and how that relates to how I see reflexivity in relation to my research and as in my practice as research, I could say. So just before we start, and I think it's quite important to mark my own position here. I know that we are going to have one of the sessions will be about positionality and where you are standing in relation to that research. So what I wanted to talk about is where these projects and these ideas that I'm talking about, where they start. So my work and my practice is mostly related to digital games. I used to be a game designer before becoming a lecturer. I still produce some things related to games. However, I mostly teach other people how to do it now. In terms of where this research stands, so I'm departing from a position where we acknowledge that games have a certain kind of are a certain kind of an exclusionary subculture. So you might be familiar with the stereotypes around, you know, masculinity in gaming, or this idea of very blokey, very white idea of techno masculinity in gaming, which is something quite acknowledged in literature. Most of my work has been inspired by interventionist game making initiatives, specifically coming from a more feminist perspective, something that has taken up in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, probably. Well, at least we had a lot of initiatives trying to do that. And of course, we're still trying. And the objective here with these interventions is to allow participants to become critically informed designers, makers, and producers. So it's not something that you find and it's quite common, especially when you go into games or digital media production, the idea of trying to buy into a neoliberal discourse related to, you know, emancipation through technology, or how technology can free people, or how it can make a contribution to economic degree. So it's more deeper than that. So I am dealing here with reflexivity. By now, I think everyone here is familiar with the idea of reflexivity, of course, but I just brought this definition, which I think it from Ronnie Berger, which I think it speaks very much to me. So it's the idea of understanding and going back and reflect about where you sit in relation to your position. Another idea that I think it's important is trying to avoid the idea of reflexivity as an individualized perspective. And I think that Mark talked about it very well, because it is something that it is about you, but at the same time, it's not only about you. So it's I'm really glad that Mark started with this very good example of how reflexivity is at the same time something that's individualized, but not completely detached from the societal elements that you are engaging with. So in relation to my work, in relation to my practice, I would say I could take here 2 turns. Of course, I have to make a choice for this presentation. So I could reflect about my own my own practice as designer and developer, basically producing the tools that the participants used to make their own games. So in this particular case, the tool is called Mission Maker, if you are interested in having a look at it later. And of course, there is a reasonably new field of inquiry looking at how the production of tools, especially in digital games, they are related to maintaining some of those hegemonic ideas that I spoke before, which of course could be one of the focus of my reflexive practice here. And important note, Mission Maker is not a game per se, but it is a tool that allows other people to make games. So they can make practically whatever they want, as long as it's doable in the game. And we'll talk about it a little bit. I'll talk more about it later. And I see also my practice as facilitator. So someone who goes into places, sometimes into schools, but also in community centers, in other places which you would call non-formal, informal learning spaces, and as a facilitator, helping other people to navigate this idea of producing a game. And this is what I will focus here in this presentation. So this context, specifically, I'm talking about a particular case, which was working in an organization in South London, a community-led organization with Latin American migrants, like myself. And there are 2 publications about it. They are kind of sibling papers. If you are more interested about this work, you can read it later, maybe. One, it's more like an explanation of what was going on. And the second one is more a reflexive account of the problems, the pitfalls, and some of the good things that happened over there. So for this presentation, I'll try to be very succinct, and I'll focus on 2 particular passages in this, and maybe 2 particular issues, problems related to my own practice in this research. So one is the problem of balancing 2 different hats at the same time. So as you know, the researcher, well, more than 2 in fact, as the one that developed the game, the tool, the facilitator, and of course the researcher that has a particular interest in there. In having some outcomes. And I reflect about my own positionality as someone who tried to see himself as an insider to the group that I was working with. So something, the insider-outsider dichotomy, something that's quite common in relation to reflexivity in research and in practice as well. So to begin with, I think that one of the problems I found was the issue of, on one hand, and I see that as a kind of a continuum. So one is a very pragmatic position on trying to make things work. And making things work, I mean, for everyone. For me as a researcher, of course, but also for the participants who are there trying to make their own games and having fun. For the institution that was that helped me to set up, who was also interested in the outcomes. And of course, for myself as a developer as well, of course, I want them to enjoy and see my practice work as it was intended to be. On the other hand, I call this inclusivity, but in fact, it is more about, you know, what was behind the whole ideas of the research. So the idea of trying to make them reflect about all the problems with hegemonic gaming that I mentioned in the beginning. So how could I support them to work against the grain and to criticize, to critically engage with gaming and game production, in fact. And that was one of the biggest challenges, because looking at, and this is one sample game produced using Mission Maker. So as you can see, it entails a particular type of game. It's a, you know, a 3D world with a single player character. So it's very close to games, mainstream games that you would find if you play games, you would find. And this kind of imaginary, it taps into the hegemonic kind of game that I was trying to go against it. So what happened is, in trying to make it work with the tool that I had at that moment, I was already kind of gatekeeping and favoring some kinds of experiences with games that was not the case for everyone that was there. So if you are someone that doesn't play computer games but play a lot of mobile games, or don't play games at all, you'd probably not have a head start as if you play games in a PlayStation, for example. So this was one of the biggest challenges, and how to find how to use the tool against itself to some extent to avoid reifying these exclusionary practices. One of the ways that we found was to work with stories. So we did a lot of storytelling and focus a lot on script writing and creating characters, which helped and which kind of leveled the field. And this was something that we did as a whole group. So of course, as a facilitator, I kind of led that process, but it was something that everyone involved in the research was interested and bought the idea. So just to bring some quotes here about the idea of the competing interests that you have, that you might find, and how reflexivity plays a role into that. So I think that these some of the solutions that you might find, depending on the kind of hat that you are wearing at that point. So as the facilitator, as a teacher, for example, one of your solutions might sound like a good idea, but as a researcher, that might create problems down the road. And I think that's one of the main aspects to bear in mind when you're dealing with these multiple hats at the same time. These, going back to the classic work from Sean about, you know, the reflection in action and reflection on action. These roles that you might assume, these multiple roles that you might assume in a research, they are not exactly the same at the same time. They are not happening in parallel. So some of your decisions might only affect you later down the road. It's something to bear in mind. So in relation to the second point, so in relation to the insider-outsider dichotomy, sorry, Nicole, how am I doing in terms of time? 2 minutes, okay, I'm going to rush this. So I am originally from Latin America as well. So one of the things that I assumed was, to some extent, we shared many common things with the participants, although they were much younger than me. We shared similar cultural backgrounds. We spoke the same language. We spoke the same language in the activities. So that helped me to find some things that probably an outsider might not pick, which is one of the maybe the perks of being an insider in this kind of research. But of course, this doesn't come with problems as well, assuming an insider position. So one of the risks is trying to see things and starting to project yourself into your own researchers, into the people you are working with. And of course, I'm going to just skip this, but these quotes are also related to that. So how my own position, how in some moments, my own position, the position that I claimed as an insider, made participants lose their voice, and I was trying to speak for them. And of course, having taking a deep breath and thinking about exactly what's going on, checking where you are sitting and what exactly they are doing might be the key for going that. So reflexivity, in other words. So I think that was the I guess my time is over, right? So that was I think I was able to cover everything, and I think that just if I could finish with that idea, I guess the main aspect of being reflexive with your own practice, in this case, be it being a game developer, being a practitioner in schools or whatever it is how to make sure that effort is not only done in a self-congratulating or a egotistical way, but as and again, going back to what Mark was saying, it is about you, of course, but it is about other people as well, and how you are related to those people, and how you can see these positionings in place and connecting to each other. Yes, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much, first of all, for your talk. I do have a question for you, but before that, one of the definitions that I've sort of read and heard, and that I tend to use a lot actually in trying to explain what reflexivity is. It goes back to what you were saying about it's about you, but it's not quite about you. It's the me search within the research. And I like that. I really do like that, because it kind of brings home that it is about searching for yourself and who you are and how you then position yourself in relation to your work. So I quite like that. It's the me search within the research. But what the question that I've got for you, Bruno, could you stop sharing the screen then as well, please, so that we can see you more than the screen again. One of the questions that I've got for you is, you were talking about reflexivity within the work that you do as facilitator as well, not just as a researcher, but also as facilitator. And the question that I have for you is, how does it work, or how do you deal with the situation where you as a facilitator could potentially influence what your participants or your workshop delegates are doing? You know, how do you do reflexivity as a facilitator, if you know what I mean? It's kind of, because obviously in that particular situation, you need to facilitate. It's your job to help, but at the same time, you don't want to skew the thought processes of the people around you. So how do you deal with that situation?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. That is probably one of the most difficult aspects of this kind of work, right? I guess in my particular way of seeing things, I would always try to Well, first, I would always try to avoid giving examples at all, which is not a very useful way of dealing with that. But it is one of the things that I realized, and I'm reflecting mostly about my game related experiences. This is one of the things that I realized. I used to do a lot of game demos and give them examples and try to, you know, start with you have this model, try to change it by yourself. And what I realize is that there's a lot of mimicking, and of course mimicking things is one way of learning. In terms of my practice and trying to not try to recognize these moments, you know, when you and I guess as you know, as instructors, as teachers, as in any kind of position, you realize at some point, oh, maybe something that I spoke has made them take this decision. I guess it is one thing that helped me a lot in this work was keeping a journal. So in the same way as you do with, I know that in arts practice, that's quite common, and in programming as well. But keeping a journal helped me to try to identify the moments when these kind of key moments happened, and that helped me to revisit them and try to address, maybe thinking other ways of doing it or reorganizing it for, you know, next iterations or things like that.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you. Really appreciate that. I've got a question from the audience. If I can hand over kindly, Dr. John Cruz.
Hi there. Hi, folks. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you ever so much. Really interesting stuff coming across. And my particular interest was, I thought there's loads of really great stuff coming over about the sort of ethics of power within those collaborative and participatory research settings. I was also going to ask you what you think about ideas about sort of the potential vulnerability that a researcher can experience if they're engaged with sort of autoethnographic or sort of solo practice research, where they're really kind of revealing their own kind of positionality in relation to their own practice, perhaps, particularly with regard to that, how that relates to notions of academic sort of legitimacy and the sort of traditional views that we should sort of be as objective and distanced from our research as possible.
Yeah, it's a great question, Bruno.
You took the baton, Mark. It's to you first.
Yeah. Okay. No, I mean, yeah, it's a brilliant question, and and it's a nightmare. And I agree with Bruno about not giving examples. At the same time, I want to go through every example that I shared, and give an account of how the things that you were talking about got played out. I'm like, there are different kind of answers. I'm a grown-up, right? I've got a certain degree of autonomy. I have a contract, which I'm very fortunate to have. Short of gross misconduct, I don't think there's a lot in higher education that they can do. I mean, we'll see how this Palestine portfolio plays out and what the consequences of that might be. But that's a different issue. I'm a teacher or a learner or a facilitator of this, that, and the other, right? And I can call myself a pedagogue or a facilitator or a steward or a custodian or a whatever it happened to be. Oh man, it kind of depends, John, right? It kind of depends how you're making yourself vulnerable and under what conditions and who's in the room and what's at stake, and whether I get a word wrong or whether somebody's got, you know, a gripe or a legitimate concern. You know, so I mean, for instance, I've got in trouble over the last couple of years for giving a couple of presentations around decolonization, you know, which I completely get. But, you know, I sit there and say, you know, as a straight white bloke who is of mixed white other heritage, you know, it's beholden upon me to play a part in trying to contribute to, you know, blah, 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 blah. You know, it's kind of the best I can do, right? You know, I can't talk about my lived experience, you know, and I recognize that, and it's not for me to do that. You know, I can share platforms, you know, I can absent myself from the platforms that I'm a part of. You know, I can resign and give my job to somebody else. Of course, the institution wouldn't give it to the person that we might want it to be given to. You know, the academic legitimacy, you know, I think when you're working in an art school, practice as research is very different. I think, you know, it's been knocking around for decades. You know, I think people have been doing PhDs in practice-led research since the early 90s. And, you know, within the REF, you know, as a unit of assessment, art and design is very comfortable with practice as research. The reason, I don't know whether Nicole shared the attachment that went along with my abstract, you know, just as an example of that issue of legitimacy, you know, curating an exhibition and there being nobody in the faculty to be able to assess its credibility as research. And they sit there and go, where's the impact? And you're like, 10,000 fucking people saw it, mate, right? Last time you published an academic article, it was read by 3 people. So, you know, the kind of the machinery and the infrastructures of legitimization, you know, are in desperate need of critique, I think, within higher education. And I think that we either capitulate or we keep pushing against it. And, you know, something like Practice as Research Network becomes an opportunity to kind of, you know, consolidate and, you know, to share and to be vulnerable, you know, perhaps because it feels like a reasonably safe space and a brave space at the same time. But, you know, to work out, you know, other ways of doing higher education and other ways of producing and sharing knowledge. And I think that's the bottom line. I think, you know, the minute we carry on defaulting, you know, to a 19th century invention of the university, you know, we're lost.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Bruno, do you want to say something about the research of vulnerability?
Yeah, I think that Mark covered really well the question of, but there was something in John's question about autoethnography and how it relates, you know, with some of the things that Mark spoke very well about power, about who pulls the strings and who decides who gets funding and whatnot. I guess one of the and this is more like it's less an answer, so it will be a little bit frustrating, but more a problem to pose back in a very Socratic tradition, I guess. One of the problems when I took an interest in autoethnographic methods for dealing with my game development side, and one of the discussions that I came across was, in fact, a kind of an ethics conundrum regarding consent and autoethnography. In fact, because to what extent do you, if you are dealing with an autoethnographic approach to something, and at some point, well, we're not completely individuals, right? So we all have relationships and everything. So to what extent are you allowed to say something that is about a relationship, where if you don't have consent from the other person, in your autoethnographic research, for example? And I don't have an answer to that. So, but it is a question of power again, right? Because you are, of course, even if you are vulnerable and you're making that clear, it is you can be to some extent reclaiming that position of power, or even maybe overstepping your position of power, depending on how it goes.
Thank you, Bruno. Can I just add, I've just put in the chat box, Caroline Ellis and Arthur Bochner have written, they are doing a lot of work around autoethnography, and they've written about the ethical conundrums, exactly the kinds of things that you were just talking about. And there's one particular article where Caroline Ellis is talking about, well, how do you do ethics in an autoethnography if the other people have already passed away? So she's dealing with grief. And how do you then write about that relationship of grief with the person that you've lost, who's actually already no longer in a position of being able to give you consent? So that's even, you know, the sort of the next level up is not just about, do you seek consent? What about you can't actually, what about that situation where you can't physically seek consent anymore? And where do you then stay within that kind of relationship? Thank you very much. A comment on vulnerability from the audience. If we are working with the participants and asking them to explore their vulnerabilities as part of the research, is there not an ethical responsibility to expose our own? That's a really interesting proposition and quite a provocation as well. I don't think there is a simple answer. But it's definitely something that we are going to be having to explore further. I'm quite aware of the time. I can't believe how quickly this hour went. And as Mark and Bruno were speaking, I kept an eye on the time. I want to make sure that we are finishing off, you know, in time and on time, so that, you know, it doesn't feel like we are trying to overload people's workload. And I definitely don't want to keep anyone longer. So with that, I would like to kind of try and wrap this up. First of all, saying thank you very much to Dr. Marquard Smith and Dr. Bruno de Paula for having done the presentations today, having kicked us off. I certainly enjoyed it. It was really, really interesting to hear about your work. It was fascinating to hear how you interpret reflexivity and how you position yourself within your own work. Obviously, this is the first of many seminars. So here is the look ahead to our next one, which is going to be called Voice, Authority and Truth. And it's going to be Anya McAllister talking about poetic and ethnopoetic analysis. So she's working with the word. So it's a slightly different approach, again, to practice as research. But she will discuss poetry as a viable method of presenting research findings, but also, you know, talking about how we can be truthful and stay within the representation, but at the same time looking at, you know, our roles as researchers within that. As a last kind of comment, I would like to say here, most of you are already on the mailing list, but if there's anyone else that you know of that would like to be added to the mailing list, do please pass on my email address and do encourage people to sign up. I'm going to be making sure that the recordings will be available, but it will be great to see you again here the next time.